Why did Orwell dislike pigs? This is a book of Orwell puzzles. It's about sort of finding oblique little ways into his psyche, into his consciousness, and the way he thought about things. Now, Orwell is the great lover of nature and the animal world. He once said, with no irony whatsoever, that some of his best experiences in life had been with animals. Several times in his life, he has small holdings. He has hens. He loves putting up hen coops. He had goats when he lived in Hertfordshire in the late 1930s. And yet there's one tantalizing exception. All the time, there's never any mention of a pig. The smallholder's joy. Where is the pig in Orwell? And I think my conclusion is that it's a case of Orwell's fastidiousness. He was a great one for sort of smelling unpleasant smells and being revolted by things that perhaps less fastidious people would not have been so outraged by. But it's a fact that Orwell didn't like pigs because he thought he finally did get one on the island of Jura in the late 1940s, just before his death. And there's a letter, I think, where he says, he admires pigs' resourcefulness, and the amount they put away and their ability to forage for scraps and so forth. But he says in this letter, he said, we're all pining for him to go to the butcher. And I remember Richard Blair, Orwell's adopted son, saying to me, he was about 5 at the time, 4 or 5, living on Jura with his father, and he was ordered not to go anywhere near where the slaughtering was taking place, but he said he knew at the age of 4 that something awful was going to happen and that it concerned the pig. Obviously, I'm a huge fan of Animal Farm in 1984, but I came to Orwell from a rather oblique route. Although I'd obviously heard and been compelled at school to read the two great novels, I came to him through his 30s fiction and then through the essays, which were originally collected in 4 Penguin volumes that I used to buy for 50p a throw at the University East Anglia bookshop. And in fact, the first Orwell novel that I ever read and really enjoyed was A Clergyman's Daughter, published in 1935, which probably even die-hard Orwell fanatics would probably concede isn't perhaps the greatest thing that he ever wrote. And there are all kinds of minor essays too, which I sort of take my stand on. But in some ways, this is a tribute to Orwell's achievement, because even the most minor pieces of his writing, the book reviews that were written typed straight onto typewriters, sometimes with bombs falling in the blitz outside the window, they still have this sparkle, they still have this spiritedness. Even in tiny minor pieces of his journalism, just sort of frothing with energy and vitality. And I would recommend them in some ways as much as the major works of his later period. 1984 is set in Landstrip 1, the capital of Oceania, which is one of the 3 contending sort of I was going to say nation states, but land blocks that are sort of permanently in contention with each other in this imagined dystopian world. It parallels our own in that it is basically London. It is the London of the immediately post-war era when Orwell was travelling through it and observing it. And so it is the world of post-war London extrapolated 35 years later. So it's very frightening because of, on the one hand, the scariness of this new world, while being set in the old world that the original audience who came across it would immediately recognize. So it's a kind of, like many dystopias, it achieves its effect by having a known world being just twisted out of kilter. So that, for example, the Ministry of Truth, where Winston Smith, his hero labors, it is pretty obviously based on the BBC, where Orwell worked from 1941 to 3. But it's a BBC where they have 2-minute hates, and people get up and sort of watch Big Brother and shout at the screen and are kind of emotionally transformed and transfixed by this experience. So it's a world on the one hand which is completely ordinary and mundane, and also completely scary and out of kilter and stretched to the limit. And that's the great kind of, I suppose that's the great beauty of it as a piece of writing. What gives it is this awful sort of terrible fugitive quality. One fascinating thing I discovered in researching this was people are always interested in the interrogation scenes in 1984, where poor hapless Winston Smith is basically taken to bits, both in the end physically, but to start with sort of intellectually by his chief tormentor, O'Brien. And there's an interesting bit in there where O'Brien is described as almost resembling a priest. And you think, what is Orwell up to here? And one of the new letters that I discovered during the course of the research, written in the early 1930s, describes Orwell being invited by a Jesuit priest called Father Martindale to discuss a book review he'd written about aspects of Catholicism in a very minor literary magazine. And Orwell describes himself as being prostrated to the point of helplessness by the rigor of the Jesuit priest's dialectic. Orwell was completely incapable of arguing against him once the Jesuit got started. And it struck me that there were tiny but significant resemblances to that letter and some of the interrogation scenes in the novel published 17 years later. So that was a very, very interesting connection to have made. Where is Animal Farm? Where did Orwell get the idea for Animal Farm? Well, for a start, there are hundreds and hundreds of places called Manor Farm all through the British Isles. And in fact, I discovered a tiny little culvert called Manor Farm Close, which is just next to the house which Orwell and his parents lived in Southwold in Suffolk in the early 1930s. It's interesting because it's a satire of the Soviet Revolution, from very early days to just before the time when Orwell finished writing it. But its actual setting, its historical setting, is interesting because the novel itself is satirizing or paralleling the years from about 1917 to about 1944, 45. But the farm itself in the novella is set in the English countryside, and apparently, so far as we can deduce, a slightly earlier period from this, because Farmer Jones and his wife have a lithograph of Queen Victoria in their parlour. The farm is completely unmechanized. When the pigs take over and start ruling the roost, they subscribe to newspapers and magazines that were current during the Great War. So I think my own view is that in finding this setting, Orwell is actually kind of remembering his own early life in the Oxfordshire countryside where he lived with his mother in the Edwardian era. And so I think in some ways it's a kind of love letter to the lost landscapes of his Oxfordshire youth. Who is Big Brother? Well, there's one theory that says that he doesn't really exist because he doesn't have to exist. He's just the kind of focal point through which the Oceanian state sort of works its wicked wiles. The smart money would say that it was Stalin because it's a satire of a dystopian regime, a totalitarian regime. The biggest totalitarian regime in existence when Orwell wrote it was Soviet Russia. And in fact, there's a very funny jacket that the Americans designed for the first paperback in 1950, which shows Winston Smith and Julia looking like, Hollywood actors. But on the wall behind them is this poster of Big Brother, and he looks like Stalin, with the refinement that the illustrator has added a pair of orc ears just to make him look even more sinister. Something else that's always interested me, and it's why we selected this photograph of Orwell for the jacket of the book. The photograph is one of the last of him that was ever taken in Islington in 1946, 3.5 years, nearly 4 years before his death. And there's a sentence in the book where Big Brother is never really described. His face is never particularly well described in 1984, but there is a moment where Orwell describes his face as being full of power and mysterious calm. And when I look at this picture of Orwell, I've always thought that it's a picture of a man whose face is full of power and mysterious calm. What does Orwell have to tell us in 2024? Well, the weird thing about his later books, about the dystopian novels, and in fact the essays he was writing at the end of the 1940s, is that without consciously straining to do so, because he never regarded himself as a prophet, he always said that 1984 was a warning, but there are substantial and rather ominous ways in which he seems to have predicted the shape of the modern world. The great land blocks kind of contending against each other, the way in which language is perverted for political ends. The great Orwell scholar Peter Davison once compiled a list of all the things that he thought Orwell had got right in 1984. And it was extraordinary when you read it. It was things like, deforestation, environmental degradation, the national lottery. I mean, that's something they have in the world of Oceania. So it's an extraordinary prescient book, but its prescience kind of benefits and is extended by the fact that he's not obviously doing crystal ball seeking. It's not as if here's a writer who's saying, "Ooh, what's the future going to be like?" It's just a writer who writes a book about the future. And all these patterns then begin to present themselves to the reader's imagination. And of course, the original impact. The original impact was even more sort of exacerbated by the fact that he set the world of Oceania in what was clearly bomb-devastated central London. And in fact, his route, when he worked at the left-wing literary magazine, the left-wing weekly magazine Tribune, in 1943 to 5, his bus route home took him through what is essentially the route of 1984 through Trafalgar Square and Big Brother with the University of London. And so the original reader in 1949 would have been reading about something set 35 years in the future, manifestly a dystopia. But if he or she looked outside the window, then there was that world staring them in the face.